And the truth of this is, if we can see, is that Jesus does not call qualified people. Simon, Peter, James, John, none of them got out of Bet Sefer. They didn't go to Bet Midrash. They didn't have the Talmud studies. They went from kindergarten, first grade, second grade, into the fishing business, and that's what they've been doing for the majority of their life. Jesus walks on the scene and says, that's who I want. I don't need your studies. I don't need your Ivy League education. I want you. And I'm going to teach you. Jesus does not call qualified people, but he's going to qualify those he calls. The word qualified is interesting here. It's got a dichotomy in it. Some of you may know this, and if you're an English teacher, you definitely know this. There's a qualified dichotomy. There's two definitions that sit in the Merriam-Webster dictionary for this word. First one is it's officially recognized as being trained to perform a particular job, or not complete or absolute. To be qualified, right? You had to qualify for your job. You had to get this certification. You had to go to school to learn the stuff. And then you were hired and you did some apprenticing. If you're in a trade, you spend time as an apprentice. The trades are great for understanding how discipleship works because you got hired. You were a journeyman and an apprentice. You kind of learned the trade and then they sent you out. Maybe you worked for somebody or maybe you went and started your own business, but you had to learn the process. But when you started it, none of you were qualified. You might have had some education to it, but you weren't complete or absolute. And so there's this dichotomy. Qualified can mean that it is, you can do the thing. Or it can mean that you're not quite there yet, but we can work on it. And normally when that happens, we look at ourselves and we're like, man, should I be able to do this? Like me standing on this stage today, there are times when I woke up at 4 a.m. in a sweat because I was like, I don't know if I should be talking about this yet. Like I don't know if I'm quite there yet. And I'm employed by the church. Like this is what I went to school for. This is what I've been doing for the last X amount of years of my life. And I still have that feeling of not being complete or absolute. And so when that happens, we see it all throughout Scripture. People are called to go do the work of God. And what do they typically say? Yes, sir, let's go. No, not at all. It's always a rebuttal, right? Moses, before a burning bush, miraculously in the middle of the desert, hears the voice of God and goes, but I've got a stutter. I can't go to Pharaoh. You got to send somebody else. I can't do this. Jacob was a liar, but yet wrestled with God and wanted a blessing, and then has his name changed and a nation is birthed out of his 12 sons. Peter, standing before God, before Jesus ever says, hey, go do this, he's like, no, not me. I didn't go through the schooling. You don't want me. I know you're a rabbi. I'm not qualified for this. And Jesus is like, hey, I'm calling you. You don't get to rebuttal. And I think rebuttals come in this way. The rebuttals to following God when he calls us is either fear or doubt. But the reality is they just manifest insecurity in our life. Moses says, I have a stutter. I can't go before Pharaoh. I didn't tell you were going on your own accord. Peter, I'm unclean, I'm sinful. That don't matter. You're not ready. You're right, but I'm going to make you ready. And so we allow these insecurities and they will sideline us. And we'll allow the insecurity of not being good enough or not being qualified enough to push us out of the game. And we'll sit on the bench. And the reality is we just sit there and collect dust. And it's not art, it's dust, but it ain't dust that we're making. We're not out there producing it. It's the dust of everybody out there getting busy and doing what they need to do or what they think they can't do already, and it just kicks up onto us. It's like the painting in the attic that got put up there 30 years ago, and you walk up and there's cobwebs and a thick layer of nastiness on it because it wasn't fit. And so they put it away, and we will allow our insecurity, our fear, and our doubt to put us there. But Jesus looks at us and says, I'm not worried about I know your insecurities. I know your fear. I know your doubt. Guess what? I can overcome those. You don't have to. I'm going to do it for you. Just come follow me. And the beautiful part about this is that you and I, at every step of the way, will continue to feel unqualified and not worthy. And he will constantly remind us, yes, you are. You didn't do anything. I called you because I will make you into something new. The first time I ever got on a stage to teach, I was 17. Had no official training other than a couple devotions that I had given during youth group and like Sunday school. And my middle school youth pastor at the time said, hey, you've helped me build this program, and I want you to come and I want you to teach these students. You're gonna give your first sermon, buddy. I'm gonna walk you through this. And I looked at him and I was like, okay. It's been affirmed in me. I've been told by people that you've got a gifting and you need to honor that and you need to pursue it. And I thought, okay, that'll come in my 20s after I've gone to Bible college and learned and had some time. And Titus looks at me and he goes, no, it's now. You're not going to be ready. That's okay. You're going to learn along the way because you're going to fail. You're going to make mistakes. We're going to coach you through it. And I was so nervous and felt so insecure. I took somebody else's sermon that I had heard at a camp that I really loved, that I bought the audio for, and I wrote it down word for word, and I changed a couple things, and that was the sermon I gave. Because I just pushed myself out of the game. I was like, I'm not qualified. This guy is. I can kind of do what he said. And if I mimic that, maybe I'll learn, right? I was always told, I don't sing well, but I was always told by people who do, one of the ways they learn to sing is they kind of find the voice that they can mimic until they can find their own. And so I applied that to teaching. I was like, okay, I really liked this guy's sermon. I can teach it. So I wrote it down word for word, changed a couple things, got up that Sunday morning for our middle school ministry at the age of 17, walked on stage, and it was I'm 33, so it was 16 years ago next Sunday. Standing on a stage, and I had my notes in front of me, and I went for 45 minutes. And if you know middle schoolers, you can't go for 45 minutes. So about 10 minutes in, they all checked out, but the lights were bright, and I was doing my thing. And they didn't pull me off the stage, and they didn't reprimand me for going over on time. But the truth of it was it was the first time I remember my stepdad looking at me and looking and saying, that was so cool. Like, that was awesome, man. You went long, but that was great. I wish I had that gifting, and I love you, and I'm proud of you. And it was the first time I felt like, oh, I'm not a kid anymore, but I'm not quite a man yet. The reality was I just allowed myself to follow somebody. And I allowed myself to be covered in the dust of somebody that was a couple steps ahead of me so that I could go on and lead better. And the reality is that disciples, people who follow, are covered in dust. And they're covered in dust not because they sat on the sidelines. They're covered in dust because they got up and they followed knowing that they couldn't do anything about it. Knowing that they weren't going to be ready, but something along the journey would put them in that space. So disciples are covered in dust.